Welcome back to Playful Whimsies. Today, we are reading Chapter 3 of Miss Piggle-Wiggle by Betty MacDonald. And today, our chapter is called The Answer Backer Cure. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Miss O'Toole put a peanut butter sandwich and an ice-cool glass of milk on the kitchen table for her little girl when she came home from school. Pretty soon the front door slammed and in bounced Mary, her red hair switching like little ponytails. Her mother said, "How was school, darling?" Mary said as she gulped her milk and took a large bite of sandwich. "Well, this afternoon Miss Crabtree said Mary O'Toole will stay in at recess and put the paint boxes away, and I said," Mary took another gulp of the milk, "You're the teacher here, Miss Crabtree. Why don't you put away the paint boxes and let me go out and play?" Everybody in the whole room laughed but mean old Mrs. Crabtree, and she sent me to the cloakroom. Mary took another large bite and looked up at her mother expectantly to see if she would appreciate how smart she was. However, her mother said, "That was a very rude thing for you to do, Mary, and I am ashamed of you. When you finish your sandwich and milk, you had better go up to your room and stay until dinner. You can concentrate on how rude you were to nice Miss Crabtree." Mary pulled her mouth down at the corners and squinted her pretty brown eyes and said, "Why should I?" She kept her mouth pulled down and blinked her eyes rapidly in a most disagreeable way. Mrs. O'Toole was dumbfounded. Never had her little Mary acted this horrid way before. She said quietly, "You should because I told you to. Now scat." Mary walked slowly out of the kitchen, switching her skirt and her braids, and even managing to look imprudent even from the back. When she reached the top of the stairs, she called down to her mother, "I'm going because I want to, but not because you tell me to," and dashed into her room and banged the door. That night, Mary was quite normal, but after dinner, her daddy said, "Scoot the dishes off the table, Wian. Your mammy's tired." And his dear little Wian, instead of jumping up and doing what she was told, pulled her mouth down until she looked like a sad jack-o'-lantern, squinted up her eyes and said, "I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. Anyway, you eat here. Why don't you clear the table?" She blinked her eyes rapidly. Her father looked as though he might be going to give her a spanking. But then he noticed that it was time for the news, so instead he went to his study, turned on the radio, and lit his pipe. Mary did clear off the table, and she dried the dishes, but she kept blinking her eyes and muttering. The next morning, her mother said, "Please hurry with your breakfast, Mary. The children are waiting. You'll make them late for school." Mary pulled her mouth down and began blinking. She said, "I'm the one that's eating this breakfast, madam." She pronounced it "madam." Mary's mother sighed and said, "If only you knew how unattractive you look when you talk like that, you would stop right now." Mary mumbled something into her mouth, then grabbed her sweater and slammed the front door. Mrs. O'Toole went to the telephone and called her friend, Mrs. Ragbag. She said, "Hello, Mrs. Ragbag. Have you noticed any change in Calliope lately?" Mrs. Ragbag said, "Well, no, I can't say I have, Mrs. O'Toole. She seems to be studying hard in class, and she eats and sleeps well." Have you noticed anything wrong with her? Mrs. O'Toole said, No, it is not Calliope I'm worried about. It is Mary. Yesterday she came home from school and she seemed perfectly normal and she looked all right, but she told me how very imprudent she had been in school. I punished her, of course. In fact, I sent her to her room to stay until dinner, but she was imprudent to me. She was rude to her father, too. I just cannot understand it. I thought perhaps all the children were acting this way. She pulls down her mouth and squints up her eyes and blinks. She looks hideous. Mrs. Ragbag said, Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. O'Toole, because Mary has always been such a dear girl. I don't know what to suggest. Why don't you call Mrs. Keystop? You know what a problem her little Chucky is. She should have some ideas. Miss O'Toole said, Thank you very much, Mrs. Ragbag. I'll call Mrs. Keystop right now. So she called Mrs. Keystop, but she wasn't at home, and the maid Nora answered the phone. Nora said, sure, and Mrs. Keystop ain't home, Miss O'Toole. But how is that dear little Mary, the one with the beautiful braids? Miss O'Toole said, Oh, Nora, that's just why I called. Mary has become so imprudent. She answers back and she pulls her mouth down and squints her eyes and she blinks. She started yesterday. I'm so upset. I called to ask Mrs. Keystop if she has had similar trouble with Chucky. Nora said, Sure, and there ain't any trouble she hasn't had with that Chucky. He's so rude he talks back to himself. But I'm thinking you best call Miss Piggle-Wiggle. That little woman has forgotten more about children than we'll ever know. She even taught Hubert Pinterest to pick up his toys. Now there's a spoiled child. Miss O'Toole said, Thank you so much, Nora. I should have thought of Miss Piggle-Wiggle in the first place. I'll call her right now. Miss O'Toole called Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle and said, Oh, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, I'm so worried about my little girl, Mary. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, I know, Mary. She has such beautiful red hair and such lovely brown eyes. Mrs. O'Toole said, Well, she still has the hair anyway, but her eyes don't look pretty anymore. She squints them up, pulls down her mouth, and blinks. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, She answers back and is imprudent, isn't she? Mrs. O'Toole said, Yes, she is. But how did you know? I do hope that she hasn't been rude to you. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, Oh, no, Mary is always very polite to me, but I can recognize the answer back or symptoms. When was she first imprudent? Oh, pardon me. Yesterday after school, she was rude to her dear Miss Crabtree. She was rude to dear Miss Crabtree, her teacher, and when I sent her to her room, she made this hideous face and said, I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, she talks in such a way that her braids twitch, and even her back looks imprudent. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, Don't worry so, Miss O'Toole. Some of the most charming children I know were once answer-backers. Fortunately, Mary has only just begun, so she can be cured in no time. Please forgive me. The cats and the dogs are having a bit of an altercation. You'll drop by here after lunch, and I will give you Penelope Parrot to keep for a while. Mrs. Garrison has been using Penelope, but she has had her for a month now, and Gary should be cured by this time. No, don't worry, Miss O'Toole. Penelope is a cure for even the most stubborn cases of answer-backishness. Mrs. O'Toole hung up the phone. She felt much better right after lunch. She went down to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house and got Penelope. Penelope Parrot was a large, cross-looking green bird who blinked rapidly. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said as she handed the cage to Miss O'Toole, "Fortunately for you, Penelope will only talk to children." During the walk home from Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's house, Penelope was quiet in a very cross, blinky-eyed sort of way. When Mrs. O'Toole hung her cage in the kitchen, she hunched down and put her head under her wing. But when, pardon me, Mary came in from school, Penelope woke up and began preening her feathers. Mary was delighted with Penelope. She said, "Oh, Mother, I've always and always wanted a parrot. Do you think she can talk?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "She hasn't said a word since I brought her home, but I was told she speaks only to children." Mary said, "Where did you get her, Mother? Is she for me? May I have her in my room for my very own?" Her mother said, "I am keeping her for a friend of mine, but when you play in your room, you may hang her cage by the window." Mary brought her milk and cookies over by Penelope's cage and was very surprised when Penelope blinked and said rudely, "Give me a bite, pig." Mary tore off a piece of cookie and poked it through the bars of the cage. Penelope snatched it and said, "Thanks, pig." Mary turned to her mother. "She's certainly not very polite, is she?" Her mother said perhaps she has been around rude people. After all, she is a parrot and repeats what she hears. Penelope blinked her eyes and said, "Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah." Mrs. Toodles looked a little shocked, but Mary laughed and said, "May I bring the children in to see her, Mother? May I?" Let's see what her mother says. Before Mrs. O'Toole could answer, Penelope began hopping up and down and blinking and yelling, "Say, are you the boss around here? Are you the boss around here? Are you the boss around here?" Mary's mother said, "I am the boss around here, Penelope, and if you are not going to be more courteous, I will put a cloth over your cage." Penelope blinked and muttered. Mary bounced up and down excitedly. "What will that do, Mother? What will that do to Penelope?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "If I put a cloth over her cage, she will think it is night and go to sleep." Penelope squawked, "I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to." Mary was certainly surprised at that because she thought she had made up that brilliant remark. She didn't dare look at her mother, so she put on her sweater and went out to find her playmates. Pretty soon she came back with 5 little friends, and they spent the afternoon standing around Penelope's cage and laughing at her rude remarks. This worried Mrs. O'Toole. If Mary thought Penelope was so amusing, then perhaps she would imitate her and become ruder than ever. So she called Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. She said in a low voice so that the children in the kitchen could not hear her, "Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, I'm rather worried because Penelope is very rude to the children. They don't mind at all. Mary thinks she's very funny and laughs at everything she says." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Just remember, Mrs. O'Toole, that this is the first day with Penelope. Let Mary be with her as much as she wishes. Keep Penelope's cage in her breakfast nook when Mary eats her lunch and breakfast, and in the dining room at night. Hang her cage in Mary's bedroom when she goes up there to play, and have Penelope sleep in Mary's room. I'm sure that you do not have to worry. Penelope has never failed me. Miss O'Toole said, All right, Miss Piggle-Wiggle. I'll do just as you say. Goodbye. Just before dinner, Miss O'Toole said to Mary, Mary, dear, send your little friends home now. It's time for you to set the table. Mary turned to her mother and began pulling down her mouth and squinting her eyes and blinking. But before she could say a word, Penelope yelled out, Say, who's the boss around here? Who's the boss around here? Who's the boss anyway? Mary's mother quickly put a cloth over her cage, politely asked the children to leave, and sent Mary to the table. When Miss O'Toole came back from the office, she took the cover off again to show him the pardon me. When Mr. O'Toole came back from the office, she took off the cover again to show him the parrot. Then she hung Penelope in the dining room window. After dinner, Mary's daddy said, Up on your toes, Miss Molly O'Toole, and scoot the dishes out to the kitchen. Mary pulled down her mouth, squinted up her eyes, blinked her eyes, but Penelope said, What am I, a servant? Work, work, work. What am I, a servant? Say, who's the boss around here? Mary's daddy laughed so hard the tears ran down his cheek, but Mary stuck out her tongue at Penelope, who was bouncing around and yelling, Only snakes stick out their tongues! Only snakes stick out their tongues! Mary pulled her tongue in quickly and shut her lips together tight. My, but she thought, Penelope was horrid. Miss O'Toole hung Penelope's cage in Mary's room, and Penelope squawked and made so much noise that Mary finally said, Oh, be quiet! And Penelope blinked and said, I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. Mary flounced into bed and turned off the light. The next morning, Mary was very slow. She could not find one of her socks, and she couldn't button her dress, and finally her mother called, Mary, dear, breakfast is waiting. Mary pulled down her mouth and squinted her eyes and said, Oh, hurry, hurry, hurry. Hurry yourself. Penelope had been preening her tail feathers, but when she heard Mary, she jerked up her head and said, Oh, hurry, hurry, hurry. Hurry yourself, Slowpoke. Hurry yourself, Slowpoke. Hurry, Slowpoke. Hurry, Slowpoke. Hurry, Slowpoke. Hurry, 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 hurry. Mary said crossly, Oh, be quiet, Penelope. And there is Mary talking to Penelope. Oops, we still have a couple more pages. Penelope said, I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. Say, who's the boss around here? Oh yeah? Oh yeah? Oh yeah? Mary ran downstairs and sat down to breakfast, leaving Penelope shouting. But Miss O'Toole ran upstairs and got Penelope and hung her cage by the kitchen window. When the children called for Mary, and Miss O'Toole said, Hurry, dear, you will make your friends late for school. Mary pulled down her mouth and squinted up her eyes and blinked, but before she could say a word, Penelope squawked, I'm the one who's eating this breakfast, madam. Hurry, 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 that's all I hear. Hurry yourself, Slowpoke. Mary was ashamed to look at her mother, so she rushed off without kissing her goodbye. Penelope yelled after her, Hurry, Slowpoke, bell's ringing, bell's ringing. When Mary came home from school that afternoon, she kissed her mother and said, "Mother, I apologize to Miss Crabtree today. She said that next week I may be monitor for the scissors." Penelope yelled, "Who said so? Who said so? Who said so? Who's the boss? Who's the boss?" Mary turned to Penelope and said, "You are a very rude bird. If you don't hush right now, I'll put the cloth over your cage." Penelope blinked and said, "Hush, hush, hush. That's all I hear. I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell." Oops, pardon me. Tell me to. I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. Who's the boss around here, anyway? Mary's mother said, "I'm the boss, and I think it's time you went home. Penelope, would you like to return Penelope? Mary, would you like to return Penelope to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle?" Mary said, "Oh, yes, mother, and may I stay and play?" Miss O'Toole said, "I think you had better come home and practice. Your music lesson is tomorrow, you know." Mary started to draw down her mouth, squint up her eyes, and blink, but suddenly she looked at Penelope, and so she turned up her mouth, opened her eyes, and smiled. She said, "All right, mother, I'll come home right after I return that rude Penelope." And that is the end of the Talker Thacker cure. And our next cure, as you can see, will be the Selfishness Cure, Chapter 4. I hope you enjoyed this Playful Whimsies and have a beautiful day.